What is the Bible? If you wanted to describe what sets the books of the Bible apart from any other book on your shelf or on the shelf of a library, what would you say to a person asking you about it? This book that we gather to read with such care and reverence. Think for a moment. With a show of hands, how many of you would say something about God in that description? Okay. It's like just about everyone would say something about God to describe the Bible. I know this isn't usually how I begin my sermons, but I ask this question because we are studying a strange book in our Bibles today and for the next 5 weeks. We're in the book of Esther. And this book in the Protestant Bible is different from other books in the Bible because it never directly references God. It doesn't say God or the Lord, no, God did this. There is no direct mention of prayer. Because of that, there have been some people throughout history who said that this book has no place in Scripture. And yet, throughout all these generations, it has remained in our canon. So why? Why would we use a book that never directly mentions God in our worship service today? What makes this book special enough to be a part of our sacred scripture with such a glaring absence? It's a question worth pondering as we consider this text and the book for the next few weeks. Whatever you think of the strange silence in relation to the divine in this book, the story of Esther is a thrilling one that involves courage. It has assassination attempts involved and political intrigue throughout it. It's full of climactic moments that make for great TV. Our Jewish friends read it every year at the Festival of Purim, and it's a boisterous and joyful time of celebration in their communities, complete with booing the name of the villain so loudly that his name can never be heard in their presence. Because the book of Esther, as much as Hollywood may want to make it into a romance, is not one. It's a dark comedy that reveals the often disturbing underbelly of corrupt power structures by bringing it into the light to laugh at it. So we open with a lavish feast held by King Xerxes of Persia. The text tells of a 180-day period, 6 months, in which he displays the vastness of his wealth, the splendor of his kingdom, to the princes and military leaders that he wants to impress with just how important he is. If you ask Xerxes what makes a good king, I think he might say a wealthy one with lavish tapestries. And this 6-month period culminates in an entire week-long banquet in a garden. And the Bible begs us to ask the question, who is running the country if all of the leaders are busy celebrating for 6 months? This can't be a very wise king. He's extravagant to the point of ridiculousness. And the text wants us to realize that. Every lavish decoration the city of Susa has to offer is on display in whites and blues and purples. Do you know how wealthy you have to be to use white linens in the days before washing machines? Abundance is the whole point of this celebration, to show off his wealth, because in his mind that makes him a good king. And if we couldn't assume from the lack of restraint in every other area related to this feast, the text really makes sure to hammer home just how much the men at this feast are drinking in verses 7 and 8. Wine was served in goblets of gold, each one different from the other, and the royal wine was abundant, in keeping with the king's liberality. By the king's command, each guest was allowed to drink with no restrictions, for the king instructed all the wine stewards to serve each man what he wished. Do you think our storyteller might have wanted us to notice the wine? So the men are very drunk, and the women are also feasting in the palace hosted by Queen Vashti. We hear a lot less about that particular celebration. On the final day, and in case we didn't get the hint, the text spells out that King Xerxes was in high spirits from wine. He sends 7 eunuchs to bring his queen so that all of his friends who have been drinking for 7 days can see how beautiful she is. After 6 months of lavishness and 7 days of uninhibited drinking, how respectful do we suppose that crowd is going to be of their queen? Absolutely shockingly, Queen Vashti does not think that this sounds like a fun time. What is genuinely shocking in the text is what comes next. Because the queen isn't just reluctant to follow this order, she actually says no. It's a bold move. We will see throughout this story that her husband is a drunken, violent, and impulsive man in a position of tremendous power. She has to know all of these things about the man she married. But still she holds her ground. She refuses to cross the threshold into the king's garden. It's the first of 3 major moments at the king's threshold in this book, but this one is marked by an absence instead of activity. The queen does not come at the king's beck and call, and the king burns with anger. And so, without taking a moment to sober up and consider his options, in the heat of the moment, the king calls over his 7 closest advisors, who most likely have also been indulging in the festivities with him. Now, generally speaking, taking counsel among friends is often a very wise course of action, especially when we are angry. But this book is a dark comedy, and you will not find any wisdom or reason among King Xerxes' advisors here. Throughout the story, we will see that the king not only is unwise in overindulgence, he is unwise in who he chooses as his advisors, and he doesn't take the time to question anything they tell him. Throughout the story, it begins to become apparent that you could talk King Xerxes into almost anything if you put a drink in his hand first. The king's advisors are worried that word of the queen's disobedience will spread. So naturally, they suggest to send out an ordinance throughout the land to tell everyone about it. They advise the king to remove Vashti from her place as queen, to banish her from the king's presence, and to send out an order in every language of the empire that every man shall be the ruler of his household. And without waiting to come out of his drunken haze and consider his options, the king does as they tell him to, without a second thought. It's an old tale. Corrupt people in power seeing one woman's disobedience as a threat to their whole ill-conceived system. And they react harshly to make an example of her and double down, pushing their control with greater force than before. People who are drunk on power often react violently and unjustly at any slight challenge to their authority. It's a story we know well. So why do we have it in our Bibles? We return to that first question. Why do we hold this book that has a lot to do with marriages but is in no way romantic with reverence? Why is a book filled with so many bleak things and no reference to God included in our scriptures with Genesis and the Psalms? Maybe the glaring absence is the point. Have you ever seen a silence that spoke louder than words? A moment in a conversation where everyone is talking around the point instead of saying it outright, and that made it even more clear and obvious. Maybe you were reading a mystery book and discovered the answer because of some major absence that just is not addressed, or watching a movie going through a montage of the passage of time and seeing an empty chair at a holiday that spoke as loudly as a gravestone could have as the story on the screen unfolds. I wonder, as many scholars and ministers who have read this book before me do, if that is not what is happening here in the book of Esther. Is this author simply writing of human things with no thought to the divine? Or is this the equivalent of a camera zooming in on Tiny Tim's empty chair in the Cratchit home? This book is bleak in many places. It mirrors the darkness we see in our own world throughout history and into our modern age. The power we see, the corruption we see, exploitation and wickedness, we find it all in this book. And just as God's name and voice are absent in this book, there are times and places in our lives when it seems like God is silent. For the people recorded in this book, living under the rule of a drunken, reckless, and violent king, I can't help but wonder if God felt very far away from them, and if the way the story is told reflects that feeling of distance. And so I read this startling absence of God in a book of the Bible as an invitation to look for God in these silences, to look for where God is at work behind the scenes, whether or not the people in the story even realize it. As we go through the book of Esther in the coming weeks, I ask you to join me in reading between the lines, in responding to the invitation this author brings to us to look for hints of the divine in the darkness. And my hope and prayer is that by doing that in this book, by practicing that discipline, we can learn to see God at work in the dark and quiet places of our own world as we look around us. And that leaves us to continue to ponder Vashti's part in this story. She is a bold woman who says no to a powerful and violent man to preserve her dignity. And her story doesn't end very happily. No one comes to her rescue as she is deposed. Her fate is left entirely to the whims of her husband and his advisors, and it makes me sad to read it, because I would love to see her vindicated and rescued. We don't know her fate, but the part that we do know about the end of her story doesn't leave a lot of room for a happily ever after for Vashti. She stands with many people throughout history who have boldly said no to those in power and faced the wrath of a tyrant, only to be largely forgotten by history in favor of the person who came next and succeeded in challenging unjust authority. But I don't think that Vashti's story ends in chapter 1 of Esther. It echoes throughout the book. I can't help but wonder if regret for his response to her leads Xerxes to respond differently a few chapters later when another queen breaks the rules. Does Vashti's no pave the way for Esther's yes, and all of the salvation that comes from it? I don't know how much consolation it would be for this queen to hear that she made a difference for the next person. that there is a God who cares about injustice, who would not let her courage be wasted. I do know that the thought gives me hope that courage is never truly wasted, that God can use all efforts, even the ones that seem to be failures at the time, to make the way for something good in this world. That God is present even in the darkness and the silences. You may feel close to God today, or you may feel like you are stuck in the dark without a glimpse of the divine. If you need help seeing God's presence in your life, the people of God are here to help you and to pray for you. If you would like to join us in seeking God in the good and bad moments of this world, or to ask for the prayer of our church, come forward now as we sing.